The quiet period for auction 110 has officially ended, so the carriers can now talk about it publicly. I know we had already gotten the results a couple of weeks back and all these numbers had been out already, but the carriers were still under a semi-quiet period. They were able to talk about it very briefly. AT&T did during their earnings call, but it was still technically considered a quiet period until today. So the only carriers that ended up getting this, paying money and getting the spectrum, T-Mobile, AT&T, and Dish. Verizon walked. They did not buy any licensing of this auction 110. So I don't anticipate a article or anything like that to come out from AT&T. I expect them to talk about this spectrum and how they plan to deploy it and how they plan to fund it at their respective analyst day in the first half of March. That's when I expect them to talk about this spectrum in more detail. They did buy the most and the largest nationwide chunk out of any carrier at the auction 110. Now, T-Mobile, they went ahead and released a press release saying that T-Mobile extends 5G leadership in auction 110. So they spent a total of almost $3 billion for an average of 21 megahertz across 184 million pops. In the wireless industry, the FCC considers 200 million pops to be nationwide, so they didn't even get a nationwide chunk of this spectrum. So I've said it in the previous video that I made about this. I still think, and this is just my opinion, I still think that almost $3 billion that they spent on this spectrum would have been better served for coverage expansion and or densification, or maybe even a little of both. I still truly believe that. But again, T-Mobile decided to go ahead and purchase up more of the spectrum, 21 megahertz on average across 184 million pops. Just for reference, on the C-band auction, they got C-band spectrum across 225 million pops. So that's considered a nationwide chunk of that spectrum. Now, they didn't literally get it nationwide, but when they deploy it and they get to covering that 200 million pops, it will be considered nationwide, quote unquote. So again, just to briefly let you guys know, I will leave this in the article. This article in the description down below. So they are referencing now this year, they're going to be able to cover 260 million people with mid-band. That number is up from 250. That was to be expected. They finished the year 2021 with 210 million covered. So that extra 10 million, give or take, I think is a realistic number. Could they potentially crush that goal and get to 275 million covered with mid-band? They potentially could get there. But again, that 260 is just a guidance. I always felt like they were going to crush the 250 million anyway. So I don't think it's too unrealistic for them to get to 275 million covered with the 2.5 spectrum. I think that's a realistic target that they can hit, especially if we do get the updated guidance as to how much they're going to accelerate the CapEx for this year. If they get to that $14-15 billion number this year, I think they can most definitely accelerate that deployment very quickly. Now, one thing I do want to say briefly, I do hope we also get another analyst day from T-Mobile because they're going to have to give us some updates. A lot has changed since the last analyst day. The last analyst day, the guidance of CapEx that they gave us included funding for the 2.5, of course, and then C-band. But there was no mention of this auction 110. So they're going to have to update the investors and the analysts as to how they plan on spending and what they plan on deploying from this spectrum and how quickly. Both spectrums from 107 C-band and 110, the DoD spectrum, they both have timelines or targeted deployment timelines that need to be met. So T-Mobile does have to deploy this spectrum with some urgency. They can't just sit on it for years and not deploy. So eventually, either this year or next year, they're going to have to start deploying this spectrum My guess, they will also wait for some type of dual band radio like AT&T to deploy both of this spectrum at the same time. That's my guess. That's my prediction on that end. It's just more efficient and more cost effective to do it this way versus having to deploy, again, two separate radios at the site. Outside of the 184 million C-band 107, auction 107 goes up to 225 pops. So beyond that, T-Mobile will only be able to deploy one radio or need to deploy one radio because they don't own any of that auction 110 spectrum in those markets. But within the 184 million pops where they also have that C-band license, that potentially is a very great opportunity to deploy C-band and this spectrum at the same time. Now, there are some markets where they bought C-band and didn't buy DoD, and then there are also some markets where they bought the DoD spectrum, but they didn't buy the C-band spectrum. So that's also something that they'll just have to update us as to how they approach this and how they plan to fund this. Is this going to mean there's a greater CapEx at the outer years 23, 24? We will see. That potentially could mean that that's the case. If they go to 14, 15 billion and they bring some of the CapEx from 23 into 22 for acceleration, I just don't see them dropping the CapEx to 6 to 7 billion in 23. That's not enough. I think they need to bump that back up to between 10 to 12 billion to deploy that C-band and that DoD spectrum effectively. They still have a rather large coverage expansion on the way where they have to scale and really catch up to the scale of Verizon and AT&T over these next several years. And they have to do so very aggressively and very quickly. I think they get there, but again, they will have to update us over the next several weeks at either an analyst day or maybe on this earnings call, February 2nd, which is this Wednesday. Maybe they'll give us a guidance. We will see. But now they will be able to talk about this spectrum since the quiet period is over during that earnings call without any repercussions. So we may get an update on guidance for this spectrum. So leave all your comments in the comment section down below. Let me know what you think about this. Maybe you also thought that $3 billion could have been better spent on densification and coverage expansion. Leave all the comments again in the comment section down below. Make sure you guys like, share, subscribe to the channel. Follow the social media outlets for more updates and interactions. This is Tyrone with Tech Life, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.